factor the following completely. If the polynomial is not factorable, write prime. So to follow along what Miss Collini did in her notes, what we're going to do to factor is we're going to start by taking the square root of this and taking the square root of this. Then we're going to write our two parentheses. And the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 9 is 3. And then we need different signs. In general, I tend to put the minus first and the plus second. It does not matter. If you prefer, you can write x plus 3 and x minus 3. Both of those mean the same thing. So the biggest difficulty on these types of problems is square root. You really do want to have a calculator, because in Algebra 2 you're not going to be using decimals, you're going to be using a calculator. But once again, what we're going to do is we're going to take the square root here and the square root here. The square root of 121 is 11. The square root of x squared is x. So notice that we put the 11x in the first spot of each parentheses. I'm going to take the square root of 100, which is 10 times 10. There is a square root button on the calculator if you haven't looked at it recently. And then we're going to put the signs in. One parenthesis has a negative sign, the other parenthesis has a positive sign. What we also have to watch out for when we're looking at these types of problems here is that we need to make sure that we have a subtraction in these problems. And as we look at problem number 3 says x squared plus 4. And yes, we can take the square root of x squared, and yes, we can take the square root of 4, but because we have a plus here, what happens is that this problem is prime. We cannot factor it anymore. As we look at problem 4, we first of all know that we don't have a square root of 8, we don't have a square root of 50, but as we take a little bit of a closer look, what happens is we notice that 8 and 50 are both even numbers, and we can take out a greatest common factor first. And if we take out a 2, which is the greatest common factor, then what we're left with is 4x squared. By the way, I took 8 divided by 2. And 50 divided by 2 is 25. And now that we have that, then we can do the difference of squares. So it's going to be 2. We're going to make our two parentheses. And the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of x squared is x. And over here, 2x. By the way, I didn't write it in, but let me switch colors here for a second, and we will write it in. But what I did is I took the square root of 4x squared, going to take the square root of 25, and the square root of 25 is 5. And then difference between two squares, different signs. Again, you can write the plus in the first parentheses and the minus in the second. It does not make any difference. So we always have to keep in mind our different methods of factoring as we finish out the year with factoring here. But when we look at our next particular problem, what's going to happen is we can take the square root of 49 and we can take the square root of 144. So that's what we eventually are going to be doing here. Once we determine we're taking the square root, we're going to set up our two parentheses. And the square root of 49 is 7. The square root of x squared is x. Square root of 144 is 12. And then we're going to have different signs. When we look at problem number 6, noticing still that there is a minus sign in this problem, that's really important for difference of squares. But we can take the square root of x squared. We can take the square root of 64. The square root of x squared is x. Square root of 64 is 8. Difference between two squares, different signs. Again, watch out as we take a quick look at this one here, because what we're looking for is the fact that we can take the square root of 25x squared. We can take the square root of 1, but once again, on this particular problem, there's a plus in there. And when there's a plus in there, that means that this cannot be factored, and therefore it's considered to be prime. When we take a look at number 8, we do have a minus sign in between there. And we can take the square root of x squared, and we can take the square root of 36. The square root of, so we're going to write down our two parentheses. Sorry, I almost forgot that. Take the square root of x squared, we get x. Take the square root of 36, we get 6. Difference between two squares, different signs. And we factored. To finish on our practice here, again, when we factor, the first thing that we should always look at when we're factoring is, do we have a greatest common factor? And in this particular problem, we have a greatest common factor. We're going to take out a 3, and when we take out a 3, we're left with x squared minus 81. So we took 3x squared divided by 3, and then we took 243 divided by 3. And now that we've done that, then we can continue with our difference of squares method. The 3 is going to remain out there. That's one of the factors of this problem. And then the square root of x squared is x. Square root of 81 is 9. And difference between two squares, different signs.